My name is Marcus Thompson, and it was 3 months ago when I took the night shift gig at the last gas station still kicking in Jeffrey City, Wyoming. If you're reading this, it's because I desperately need someone to understand what happened to me out there. What might still be happening to me even now. I was beyond desperate when I stumbled across the job posting on Craigslist. 23 years old, a college dropout from Cheyenne, living in my beat-up car, and clinging to the increasingly thin patience of friends who were growing weary of my excuses. My savings account held a pathetic $47.33. My credit cards were maxed to their limits, and I figured I had maybe a week before I'd be permanently calling my car home. The listing was short but seemed like a genuine miracle. Night shift attendant, remote location, $35 an hour. Must be reliable and follow specific procedures to the letter. $35 an hour to pump gas and man a register in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. It all seemed too good to be true, but when you're drowning, you don't exactly scrutinize the rope they throw you. The phone interview lasted maybe 10 minutes, tops. Joyce Martinez, the day manager, asked me basic questions about my availability and how I'd get around. When I mentioned I had a reliable car and zero family obligations tying me down, she seemed satisfied enough. The job's in Jeffrey City, she said. You know where that is? I'd heard of it vaguely. Some old mining town that went belly up back in the 80s. About an hour southwest of Casper, right? That's the place, she confirmed. It's quiet out here, real quiet. But the pay is good because we need someone who can handle the isolation and follow procedures exactly. Some of our customers have particular ways they like things done. Particular how? I inquired. Oh, small towns, people get set in their routines. I'll train you on everything when you get here. Can you start Monday? I said yes before she even finished the question. The drive to Jeffrey City on that Sunday evening in late October felt like traveling back in time. Highway 287 stretched endlessly through a high desert landscape, dotted with sagebrush, distant mountains, and a sky so vast it made me feel like an ant crawling across a dinner plate. As the sun dipped behind the Wind River Range, the landscape took on an almost otherworldly quality, painted with purple shadows and a gold light that seemed to emanate from something other than the sun itself. Jeffrey City appeared suddenly after a long curve in the highway. My first impression was of a place that had been abruptly abandoned in the middle of daily life. Empty houses lined streets still illuminated by working streetlights, their windows dark and yards choked with weeds. A rusted playground sat forlornly beside a school building with boarded-up windows. The skeletal ruins of the uranium mill loomed against the desert sky like the remains of some massive prehistoric beast. But in the center of it all, impossibly, was a gas station with its lights blazing. The Atomic Stop, its name painted in faded 1970s lettering across a sign that probably hadn't been updated since the uranium boom, was the only business showing any flicker of life. Fluorescent lights buzzed behind windows displaying sun-faded advertisements for soda brands long gone. A lone customer was filling up at Pump 3, an older man in work clothes who offered a polite nod when I pulled in. Joyce met me at the front door. She was probably in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent battling Wyoming weather. Her smile was genuine but tinged with weariness, and she moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd been managing the same small business for most of her adult life. Marcus, right on time. How was the drive? Long but not bad. This town is smaller than I expected. Most folks moved on after the mine closed, but some of us stayed. Come on, let me show you around. The gas station was surprisingly larger than it appeared from the outside, with rows of shelves stocked with the usual convenience store fare, a small deli section, and a back office that looked like it hadn't been touched since the Carter administration. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but there was something almost museum-like about the place, as if it had been perfectly preserved from an earlier era. The night shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Joyce explained as we walked through the store. Most of our customers are truckers making the run between Rawlins and Rivorton, but we get local folks, too. Some of them have been coming here for decades, and they've got particular ways they like things done. She led me behind the counter and pointed to a handwritten list taped to the register. "These are the procedures I need you to follow exactly. They might seem odd, but trust me, they keep everyone happy and safe." I scanned the list, trying to decipher what appeared to be the most specific customer service guidelines I'd ever encountered. Jeffrey City Atomic Stop Night Shift Procedures. Never ask customers about the old days in Jeffrey City. They might tell you to. If someone pays with Uranium One company script, accept it and don't check the date. Keep the Geiger counter behind the register running. If it clicks rapidly, serve customers quickly and avoid eye contact. Don't sell cigarettes to customers wearing Western Nuclear Corporation uniforms. They're vintage and shouldn't exist. If the town streetlights all turn on simultaneously, lock the doors until they turn off. Between 2 and 4 a.m., only serve premium unleaded. Regular gas reminds them of the refinery explosion. If customers mention the mine opening back up, agree enthusiastically and don't ask questions. Never go outside when you hear the uranium trucks driving past. They stopped running in 1982. "This is very specific," I said, looking up at Ask Joyce. "What's with the Geiger counter?" She gestured to a yellow device sitting behind the cash register. Its needle resting at 0. Left over from the uranium days. Some folks around here are sentimental about the old equipment. Just keep it running. Makes them feel more comfortable. And the company script? Oh, some of the old-timers still have bills from when the mine was operating. Technically legal tender, and it keeps them happy to use it. Bank doesn't mind. I nodded, though none of this made much sense. What about Rule 6? Something about a refinery explosion? Joyce's expression tightened slightly. There was an accident back in 82. Killed some folks. People around here can be sensitive about reminders. Just use premium during those hours. It's a different color. Doesn't trigger bad memories. The rest of the training was straightforward enough. Joyce showed me how to operate the pumps, work the register, and handle the basic maintenance tasks. She introduced me to the apartment above the gas station where I'd be staying. A simple one-bedroom space with basic furniture and a kitchenette. Previous night employee lived here too, she mentioned as she showed me around. Tommy Kowalski worked here for about 2 years before he moved on. Moved on to where? Different opportunities. You know how it is with young folks. They get restless. Want to see what's over the next hill. That first night, Joyce stayed until midnight to help me get oriented. The work was exactly what I'd expected. Pumping gas for truckers, selling energy drinks and snacks, keeping the coffee fresh. But there was an odd quality to the customers that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first unusual customer arrived around 11:30 p.m. He was an older man wearing a Western Nuclear Corporation jacket that looked like it had been made yesterday, but bore a company logo I was pretty sure I'd never seen before. When he asked for cigarettes, I remembered Rule 4 and politely explained we were out of his brand. "That's all right, son," he said, paying for his gas with bills that felt oddly thick and had serial numbers that seemed too long. Probably for the best anyway. Company's been pushing safety protocols pretty hard lately. Safety protocols? Oh, radiation exposure limits, proper ventilation in the shafts, that sort of thing. Can't be too careful working around uranium. I nodded politely, though I was pretty sure the uranium mine had been closed for decades. After he left, I noticed the Geiger counter had been clicking softly the entire time he was in the store. When the needle returned to 0, the clicking stopped. Around 1 a.m., a woman named Sarah Chan stopped for coffee and snacks. She was probably in her 40s, with graying hair and the kind of practical clothing that suggested she worked outdoors. What struck me was how precisely she counted out exact change, not checking the total on the register, but knowing exactly how much everything cost before I rang it up. "Been shopping here long?" I asked. "Oh, decades. Same prices for most things, not like the big cities where everything changes every week." She paused, looking out at the empty highway. "Weather's been strange lately, hasn't it? Warmer than it should be for late October. Reminds me of the fall of 82. Was that a particularly warm year?" Her expression became distant, almost dreamy. "Oh yes, right up until the explosion. Then everything got cold real fast. She left before I could ask what explosion she was referring to. The Geiger counter had been clicking during her visit, too. I realized the soft, rhythmic clicks that I was starting to notice followed a pattern with certain customers. The strangest encounter came around 3 a.m. when a small group of men in work clothes stopped for coffee and fuel. They moved with the easy familiarity of people who work together regularly, talking shop in the specific shorthand of industrial workers. Ventilation's been better since they installed the new fans in Shaft 7. One was saying, "About time. We've been breathing that dust for months. OSHA's finally paying attention after what happened at the Lucky Strike. Different company, different protocols. We're safer here." They paid with what looked like company script, official-looking bills with Uranium One Corporation printed across the top and serial numbers that started with letters instead of numbers. Following Rule 2, I accepted the payment without question, though the bills felt strangely new for what should have been vintage currency. "Mine's been busy lately," one of them mentioned as they prepared to leave. "Word is they might be opening new shafts soon. More employment opportunities." "That's great news," I replied, remembering Rule 7. Always good to hear about the mine expanding. They seemed pleased by my response and left, talking enthusiastically about production quotas and safety improvements. Only after they were gone did I realize I'd never seen their vehicle arrive or leave. I just suddenly noticed their voices outside, then silence after they departed. It was nearly 4 a.m. when I decided to explore Tommy's belongings in the apartment upstairs. Most of it was typical college-age guy stuff. Clothes, textbooks, a PlayStation that looked like it hadn't been used in months. But hidden behind a loose board in the bedroom closet, I found a composition notebook filled with handwritten entries. The first few pages were mundane: work schedules, customer observations, complaints about the isolation. But as I read further, the tone became increasingly concerned. Day 12. The Geiger counter readings don't make sense. Some customers make it click constantly, but they seem perfectly healthy. Asked Joyce about it. She just said, "Old equipment acts up sometimes." Day 18. Started paying attention to the company script payments. Bills look brand new, but they're supposedly from the 1980s. Serial numbers don't match any currency database I can find online. Day 28. Found newspaper clipping about 1982 refinery explosion in the town library. 23 workers killed. Recognized some of the faces from the customer photos. Same names, same faces 40 years later. Asked Joyce about it. She just said, "Old equipment acts up sometimes." Day 18. Started paying attention to the company script payments. Bills look brand new, but they're supposedly from the 1980s. Serial numbers don't match any currency database I can find online. Day 28. Found newspaper clipping about 1982 refinery explosion in the town library. 23 workers killed. Recognized some of the faces from the customer photos. Same names, same faces 40 years later. Day 35. Something's wrong with the radio. After midnight, it only picks up songs from the late 70s and early 80s. Weather reports always say it's 1982. Local news talks about mine production like it's still operating. Day 42. Customers know things about me I never told them. Frank Miller asked about my mother's maiden name today. I've never mentioned my family to anyone here. Day 45. Joyce keeps talking about helping newcomers adjust. Adjust to what? The isolation, the weird customers, or something else? The final entry was dated just 3 weeks ago. Day 58. I remember the crash now. I remember walking away from my car on Highway 287, seeing the gas station lights in the distance. I remember thinking how lucky I was that someone was open so late. But I also remember the impact, the rolling, the sound of metal tearing. I remember dying. If someone finds this notebook, you need to understand. Jeffrey City isn't what it seems. The customers aren't what they seem. And if you're working here, if you took this job because you were desperate and the pay seemed too good to be true, then you probably aren't what you seem either. Check the personnel files in Joyce's office. Look for your own name. Look for the date you were hired. Then try to remember how you really got here. I closed the notebook, my hands shaking violently. Outside, I could hear the distant rumble of heavy trucks on the highway. But when I looked out the window, the road was empty, swallowed by the desolate landscape. The Geiger counter downstairs was clicking steadily. Though no customers were in the store, its rhythm a constant, unsettling pulse. As dawn approached, the clicking stopped abruptly, and Jeffrey City fell into the profound silence that would become intimately familiar over the coming weeks. A silence that pressed in on you. I made coffee, the bitter aroma filling the small space, and tried to convince myself that Tommy had just been suffering from isolation-induced paranoia. Small towns bred strange stories, and working alone at night could make anyone's imagination run wild, conjuring shadows where there were none. But as I watched the sun rise over the abandoned uranium mill, its skeletal frame a stark reminder of forgotten industry, I couldn't shake the feeling that Tommy's final words weren't the ramblings of a disturbed mind. They were a warning, etched in fear and desperation, and I was probably already too late to heed it, caught in a web I didn't yet understand. The second week at the atomic stop began with what I initially perceived as routine, the mundane rhythm of small-town gas station life. But looking back now, I realized it was the beginning of my descent into something far more sinister than small-town isolation, a darkness that clung to the edges of reality. I was starting to get used to the long nights, the empty highways stretching into the inky blackness, and the peculiar customers who seemed to drift in and out of the fluorescent-lit sanctuary like moths drawn to a flickering flame. But beneath the surface of this manufactured normalcy, unsettling patterns were emerging that made my skin crawl, raising gooseflesh on my arms despite the warm air. It started with Frank Miller. He was probably in his 50s, with graying hair receding at the temples and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades spent wrestling with heavy machinery, hands calloused and worn. He came in every Tuesday at exactly 11:47 p.m., a precise ritual, ordered $40 of regular unleaded at Pump 3, and bought a cup of coffee and a package of beef jerky, his choices unwavering. The first time I served him, I thought nothing of it, dismissing him as just another local. The second time, I noticed he paid with the exact same bills, crisp company script that looked fresh from the mint, despite being dated 1981, a detail that niggled at the back of my mind. The third Tuesday, I paid closer attention, my senses on high alert. Frank walked through the door at 11:47 p.m. precisely, moving with the mechanical precision of someone following a script they'd memorized long ago, each step measured and deliberate. He nodded politely, a brief, almost perfunctory gesture, selected his items with the same practiced movements, and approached the counter with the same sequence of movements I'd observed the previous weeks, his routine unchanging. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying the flat effect of someone reciting lines, the words devoid of emotion. $40 regular at Pump 3 and these items. I rang up his purchase, watching his face carefully, searching for any sign of what lay beneath the surface. There was something profoundly unsettling about his eyes, a vacant quality that sent a shiver down my spine. They seemed to focus just slightly to the left of wherever he was looking, as if he was seeing something that existed a few inches away from reality, a world just out of reach. "Working late again?" I asked, trying to break the pattern to disrupt the unsettling predictability. Frank's expression flickered momentarily, like a television changing channels, the image unstable. For just a moment, his eyes met mine directly, and I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A depth of exhaustion that seemed to span decades, an immeasurable weariness, and beneath that, a profound confusion that suggested he didn't quite understand where he was or why he was there, a lost soul adrift in time. "Always working," he replied, his voice sounding different now, less scripted and more genuinely weary, the words heavy with the weight of endless labor. "Mine never stops, you know. 3 shifts round the clock. Got to keep the uranium flowing." The Geiger counter behind the register, which had been clicking softly since he entered, a subtle background hum, suddenly erupted in a rapid-fire burst of radiation detection, the clicks accelerating into a frenzied staccato. Frank's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes widening in momentary alarm, and for a moment, his face went completely blank, as if someone had just switched off a machine, the lights extinguished. Then he smiled that same polite, empty smile, a mask of normalcy, and completed his transaction exactly as he had the previous weeks, the routine reasserting itself. "Have a good evening," he said, walking toward the door with identical measured steps, his movements precise and unwavering. I watched through the window as he approached pump 3, his figure receding into the night, but in the time it took me to blink, he was simply gone, vanished without a trace. The pump registered $40 of fuel dispensed, a phantom transaction, but there was no vehicle, no Frank, no evidence that anyone had been there at all except for the lingering scent of machine oil, a greasy, metallic odor, and something else, something indefinable that reminded me of the sterile smell that clings to clothes after visiting a hospital, a scent of antiseptic and something vaguely unnatural. Sarah Chun followed a similar pattern, appearing every Thursday at 1:23 a.m. with the same gray work clothes, faded and worn, and the same canvas bag, its contents a mystery. She bought the same items: coffee, 2 energy bars, and a bottle of water. Her choices as predictable as the sunrise, and paid with bills that looked decades old but felt crisp and new, an anachronistic paradox. Like Frank, she seemed to be following an invisible script, her movements precise and rehearsed, a marionette dancing to an unseen puppeteer's strings. But unlike Frank, Sarah occasionally deviated from her pattern in small ways, subtle shifts in her behavior that were somehow more unsettling than the repetition itself, hinting at a deeper disturbance. She might comment on the weather, mentioning how paid with bills that looked decades old but felt crisp and new, an anachronistic paradox. Like Frank, she seemed to be following an invisible script, her movements precise and rehearsed, a marionette dancing to an unseen puppeteer's strings. But unlike Frank, Sarah occasionally deviated from her pattern in small ways, subtle shifts in her behavior that were somehow more unsettling than the repetition itself, hinting at a deeper disturbance. She might comment on the weather, mentioning how it reminded her of specific dates in 1982. She possessed a knowledge of my life that bordered on the impossible, details I'd never breathed to another soul. My mother's maiden name, the Cheyenne street where I'd spent my childhood, even the name of my first grade teacher. "You're adapting well," she told me one Thursday night, meticulously counting out exact change. "Not everyone does. Some people fight it." "Fight what?" Her expression clouded over, becoming distant, almost dreamy. "The routine, the way things work here. Some people think they can change things, make them different than they're supposed to be." Her gaze locked onto mine then, and her eyes held a sadness so profound it made my chest ache with a sympathetic pang. "But the patterns are there for a reason. They keep us safe." The uranium work crew was, without a doubt, the most disturbing of all. 5 men who materialized every Friday at 2:45 a.m., always in the same precise order, always clad in identical Western Nuclear Corporation uniforms that looked as though they'd been freshly pressed that morning, despite bearing company logos from a corporation that had ceased to exist 40 years prior. They moved through the store with an unnerving, practiced efficiency, each man selecting specific items before converging at the counter to pay collectively with company scrip. Their conversations were the most unsettling aspect of their visits. They discussed mine conditions, safety protocols, and production quotas with the detailed knowledge of individuals actively engaged in uranium extraction. They referenced shift supervisors by name, mentioned equipment by model number, and shared workplace gossip about people who had died decades before I was even born. "Heard they're opening Shaft 7 next month," one would say. "About time. We've been needing the extra capacity since the Lucky Strike incident. Different company, different safety standards. We're in good hands with Western Nuclear. OSHA's finally starting to take radiation exposure seriously. New protocols came down from corporate yesterday." They spoke with the confident authority of men who knew their jobs intimately. But their faces held the same strange, unsettling quality I'd noticed in Frank Miller and Sarah Chun. Eyes that seemed to focus on points in space that didn't quite align with the physical world around them. The Geiger counter went absolutely haywire whenever they were in the store, clicking so rapidly it sounded like pure radio static. By my third encounter with them, I'd learned to serve them quickly and diligently avoid direct eye contact, precisely as rule number 3 specified. When I forgot and looked directly at the man paying with company scrip, his face began to flicker like a malfunctioning television signal, revealing brief, disturbing glimpses of something underneath that made my stomach lurch violently. After they departed, I would invariably find the store subtly, yet undeniably different. Products rearranged on shelves, new, inexplicable scratches on the floor, sometimes even entirely different products altogether. One Friday morning, I discovered an entire display of candy bars with packaging I'd never encountered before, featuring logos and designs that looked as though they belonged in a museum dedicated to 1970s graphic design. By the third week, I could no longer ignore the implications, the dreadful truth that was staring me in the face. I was serving the same customers repeatedly, customers who adhered to identical patterns, paid with impossible currency, and discussed a uranium mining operation that had been defunct for 40 years. The Geiger counter's erratic behavior strongly suggested they were all somehow radioactive, and their unsettling knowledge of my personal history implied a level of surveillance that should have been utterly impossible. I desperately needed answers, and I needed them from sources other than Ask Joyce, who had made it abundantly clear that some questions were simply not welcome. The Rollins Public Library was a 40-minute drive from Jeffrey City, and I made the trip on my day off, driven by a mixture of desperation and a morbid, scholarly curiosity. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, seemed genuinely surprised to see someone researching Jeffrey City's history. "Not many people interested in that story anymore," she said, leading me to a dimly lit section of local history archives. "Most folks prefer to forget about what happened up there." "What did happen?" She pulled out several well-worn manila folders stuffed with yellowed newspaper clippings, faded government reports, and haunting photographs. Jeffrey City was supposed to be the uranium capital of America. Thousands of people moved there in the 70s, convinced they'd found their fortune. Then, she paused, studying my face with a knowing look. Then the market collapsed in '82, and most everyone left. But before that, she trailed off. Before that, there were accidents. The files painted a grim picture of industrial disaster and unimaginable human tragedy that made my bizarre discoveries at the atomic stop gas station suddenly, horribly clear. The refinery explosion of March 15, 1982, had claimed the lives of 23 workers in what the official reports described as a catastrophic failure of safety protocols. The mine collapse of May 8 had trapped 15 men underground for 3 agonizing days before rescue efforts were ultimately abandoned. Throughout the long, hot summer of 1982, dozens more workers had succumbed to radiation exposure, catastrophic equipment failures, and a litany of other industrial accidents. But it was the photographs that made my hands tremble uncontrollably and my vision blur with a sudden onrush of tears. Face after face of uranium workers, miners, and processing plant employees, Frank Miller, Sarah Chun, and every single member of the Friday night work crew, stared back at me from faded obituary photos dated 1982. Same faces, same names, same clothing, but undeniably, irrevocably 40 years dead. I photocopied everything I possibly could, my mind racing to process the utterly impossible implications. The customers I'd been serving weren't just strange or eccentric. They were, quite simply, impossible. They were dead people, somehow preserved in the moment of their deaths, endlessly carrying out the same routines they'd followed in life. The drive back to Jeffrey City felt like a descent into a waking nightmare. Every mile brought me closer to a place where the fundamental laws of physics and biology apparently held no sway, where dead uranium workers continued their shifts in perpetuity, and where I was somehow, inexplicably, expected to serve them coffee and pump their gas as if this was the most natural, commonplace thing in the world. That night, I confronted Ask Joyce during the shift change. The photocopied obituaries spread out across the counter like a grim deck of cards, pointing to faces she undoubtedly recognized. "These people are dead," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and stark, unadulterated fear. "They died 40 years ago, but they're coming into this gas station every night like nothing happened," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and stark, unadulterated fear. "They died 40 years ago, but..." Ask Joyce studied the papers with an expression I couldn't read, then looked up at me, her eyes holding depths of sadness I was only beginning to understand. "Some things are better left alone, Marcus Thompson," she said quietly. The folks here have found their peace. Don't disturb that. Peace? They're dead? Asked Joyce. How is that peaceful? You don't understand, she sighed. After the accidents, after all the tragedy, this place became special. A place where people could continue being who they were, doing what they loved, even after their bodies failed them. The atomic stop serves them just like it serves the living. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with it? I stared at her in disbelief. Everything is wrong with it. This isn't natural. This isn't how death is supposed to work. Asked Joyce's expression hardened. And what do you know about how death is supposed to work? You're 23 years old, Marcus Thompson. You've probably never lost anyone important to you. These people, Frank Miller, Sarah, the work crew, they were good people who died before their time. If they can find some comfort in continuing their routines, who are we to take that away from them? But they're not really alive. They're just echoes or shadows or something. They're what they choose to be. And as long as you follow the shift procedures, as long as you treat them with respect and don't ask questions that don't need answering, everyone stays safe and happy. Safe from what? Asked Joyce was quiet for a long moment, studying my face as if trying to decide how much truth I could handle. From remembering, she said finally. From understanding what happened to them. From accepting that their time is over and they need to move on. The implication hit me like a physical blow. You mean if they realize they're dead? They become angry, confused, sometimes violent. The shift procedures aren't just about customer service, Marcus Thompson. They're about keeping everyone calm and stable. They're about maintaining the balance between the living and the dead. I spent the rest of that night in a state of shocked numbness, mechanically following the shift procedures Ask Joyce had taught me, while my mind struggled to process the reality of my situation. I was working in a gas station that served both the living and the dead, following rules designed to prevent supernatural customers from realizing their true nature in a town that existed as some kind of way station between life and death. And somewhere in the back of my mind, Tommy's final journal entry echoed with new and terrifying significance. I remember the crash now. I remember walking away from my car on Highway 287, seeing the atomic stop lights in the distance. Had Tommy died in that crash? Was he just another dead employee serving dead customers? All of them trapped in an endless loop of denial and routine? As dawn approached and my shift ended, I found myself studying my reflection in the atomic stop's windows, looking for signs that I might not be as alive as I thought I was. My face looked normal, my eyes focused where they should, and my breathing fogged the glass in the cold morning air. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, some crucial detail about my own situation that would make everything else make terrible sense. The Geiger counter clicked softly behind me as I locked up the store. And for the first time since I'd started working at the atomic stop, I wondered if it was clicking because of something outside the store or because of something that had been inside all along. The fourth week at the atomic stop began with a sense of impending doom that I couldn't shake, like standing in the path of an avalanche and hearing the first crack of shifting snow. Ask Joyce's revelation about the shift procedures protecting dead customers from remembering had fundamentally changed how I viewed every interaction, every routine transaction, every polite smile from customers who had been dead for 40 years. I'd spent my days off researching everything I could find about Jeffrey City's uranium disasters, driving to libraries in Casper and Cheyenne, searching online archives, even calling the Wyoming Department of Health to ask about radiation exposure records. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that I was working in some kind of supernatural way station where the dead continued their routines in blissful ignorance of their actual condition. But knowledge I was about to discover was a dangerous thing in a place built on collective denial. It was Wednesday night, 2:47 a.m., when everything went wrong. The uranium work crew had arrived at their usual time, moving through their familiar routine with the mechanical precision I'd come to expect. 5 men in identical Western nuclear uniforms, discussing shaft conditions and safety protocols as if they just finished their shift instead of dying in an industrial explosion 4 decades ago. They selected their usual items: coffee, energy bars, bottled water, and approached the counter with company script that felt warm to the touch. I was tired, more than tired, exhausted from 3 weeks of interrupted sleep, paranoid investigation, and the constant low-level dread that came from serving customers who shouldn't exist. When the lead worker, a man named Bill Kowalski, according to the 1982 obituary I'd found, requested fuel at pump 6, I mechanically began preparing the transaction. "Regular unleaded," he said in that flat, scripted tone they all used. $42. Without thinking, I authorized pump 6 for regular gas. It wasn't until I heard the first scream that I realized what I'd done. The clock on the register read 2:53 a.m. It was Wednesday. Between 2 and 4 a.m., rule number 6 was absolute. Only serve premium unleaded. Regular gas reminds them of the refinery explosion. Bill Kowalski's face began to change the moment the regular gas started flowing. His skin grew pale and regular unleaded. He said in that flat, scripted tone they all used, $42. Without thinking, I authorized pump 6 for regular gas. It wasn't until I heard the first scream that I realized what I'd done. The clock on the register read 2:53 a.m. It was Wednesday. Between 2 and 4 a.m., rule number 6 was absolute. Only serve premium unleaded. Regular gas reminds them of the refinery explosion. Bill Kowalski's face began to change the moment the regular gas started flowing. His skin grew pale and waxy, then started to peel and blister as if he was being burned from the inside. His eyes rolled back, revealing only whites that glowed with an unnatural phosphorescence. And when he opened his mouth to scream, the sound that erupted was like steam escaping from a ruptured boiler. "The explosion!" he shrieked, his voice layered with harmonics that made the windows rattle. "It's happening again. The containment breach. Everyone out of the processing facility." The other 4 workers began screaming in unison, their faces transforming just as Bill's had, their Western nuclear uniforms starting to smoke and char as if they were reliving their deaths in real time. The stench of burning flesh and industrial chemicals filled the gas station, and the Geiger counter behind the register erupted in a sustained burst of clicking that sounded like machine gun fire. "Radiation leak in Sector 7. One of them howled. "Emergency protocols. Everyone to the decontamination showers. We can't get out," another cried, clawing at his face as his skin began to slough off in radioactive patches. "The doors are sealed." The automatic lockdown system triggered. I stumbled backward from the counter, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the pump shut-off controls. But it was too late. The damage was done. By violating rule number 6, I had triggered some kind of collective memory in the dead workers, forcing them to relive the traumatic moments of their deaths. And their anguish was spreading. Through the gas station windows, I could see the streetlights of Jeffrey City beginning to flicker in sequence, as if responding to some supernatural signal. Other customers who had been in the store, Sarah Chun, Frank Miller, an elderly woman I'd never seen before, all began to convulse and scream, their faces cycling through expressions of confusion, terror, and rage. "What year is it?" Sarah Chun demanded, grabbing my arm with fingers that felt like ice. "What happened to the mine? Where is everyone? Where are all the people?" Frank Miller's face was flickering like a broken television, shifting between his normal appearance and something gray and decomposed. "I was supposed to go home," he moaned. "My wife is making dinner. My kids are waiting for me. Why can't I go home?" The elderly woman I didn't recognize began to age rapidly before my eyes, her hair turning white, her skin wrinkling and sagging as decades of death caught up with her physical form. 60 years, she whispered in a voice like grinding stone. 60 years I've been coming here, buying the same groceries, following the same routine. But my house is empty. My family is gone. What happened to my family? The gas station itself seemed to be responding to the collective breakdown. Fluorescent lights flickered and sparked overhead, casting shifting shadows that made everything look wrong and unstable. The shelves began to rattle, and products fell to the floor as if the building was experiencing an earthquake. But most terrifying of all was the sound. A low, mournful wailing that seemed to emanate from the very walls, as if the structure itself was crying. I ran. I bolted through the back door of the gas station and into the Wyoming night, my breath forming clouds in the sudden cold that had descended over Jeffrey City. Behind me, I could hear the screams of the dead workers continuing, but now they were joined by other voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, crying out in confusion and anguish. Every streetlight in town was now blazing with an intensity that hurt to look at directly, casting harsh shadows that moved independently of any physical objects. As I ran through the empty streets, I began to see figures in those shadows, translucent shapes wearing clothing from different eras, all walking purposefully toward the gas station as if answering some silent call. The town I'd thought was mostly abandoned was revealing its true population. They had always been here, the dead of Jeffrey City, maintaining their routines in a collective delusion that life continued as it always had. And now that delusion was cracking, forcing them to confront the reality of their situation. I ran past the abandoned school, its playground now filled with ghostly children in 1970s clothing, swinging on rusted swing sets and playing games with no apparent rules. Their laughter echoed through the night, but it was the wrong kind of laughter, hollow and desperate, like people pretending to have fun when their world was ending. The uranium mill ruins were glowing with their own light now, a sickly green phosphorescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. Figures in radiation suits moved through the rubble, carrying equipment that cast no shadows and left no footprints. They were still working, still trying to contain a disaster that had happened 4 decades ago, trapped in an eternal loop of emergency response. I tried to reach my car, but the streets of Jeffrey City had become a maze that defied geography. Roads that should have led to the highway instead curved back on themselves, bringing me again and again to the same intersection near the gas station. Street signs pointed in impossible directions, and the mountains that should have been visible on the horizon were now hidden behind a wall of swirling darkness. It was then that I understood Jeffrey City wasn't just a town where dead people continued their routines. It was a prison, a supernatural trap designed to keep the dead from moving on to whatever came after life. And by violating the rules that maintained the delicate balance, I had triggered a catastrophic breakdown that threatened to destroy the fragile peace the residents had found in denial. As dawn approached, though the sun seemed reluctant to rise over the chaotic town, I found myself back at the gas station. The screaming had stopped, but the damage was obvious. The building's windows were cracked, merchandise was scattered across the floor, and the Geiger counter was clicking at a rate that suggested dangerous levels. The Geiger counter screamed of radiation exposure. Joyce was waiting for me in the parking lot. Her face was a mask of grimness, her eyes holding a deep sadness that seemed to carry the weight of decades of disappointment. "You broke the rules," she stated simply. "I didn't mean to," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I was tired. I wasn't thinking." "The rules aren't suggestions, Marcus," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "They're not arbitrary customer service policies. They're the only thing standing between the dead and the realization that they're dead." She gestured towards the town, where figures still wandered the streets in obvious confusion and distress. "And now," she continued, "they remember." "Remember what?" I asked, dread creeping into my voice. "Everything. The explosion, the mine collapse, the radiation poisoning, the economic collapse that scattered their families to the wind, the fact that their lives ended 40 years ago, and they've been living in a collective delusion ever since." I looked around at the chaos I'd created, feeling the immense weight of responsibility crushing me. "How do we fix it?" I asked, desperate for a solution. Joyce's expression was unreadable. "We don't. Once the memory barrier is broken, it can't be repaired. The dead have to choose now. Accept their condition and move on to whatever comes next, or fight against it and become something angry and vengeful. And if they choose to fight," she warned, "then Jeffrey City becomes something much darker than it already is. A place where the dead prey on the living, where anger and denial create monsters that can never be satisfied." As if summoned by her words, Bill Kowalski appeared around the corner of the gas station. But this wasn't the polite, scripted customer I'd been serving for weeks. His Western nuclear uniform was charred and smoking. His face was a grotesque patchwork of radiation burns and exposed bone, and his eyes burned with a fury that made the air around him shimmer with heat. "You," he said, pointing a finger that was more bone than flesh at my chest. "You did this to us. You made us remember." "I'm sorry," I stammered, fear choking my words. "I didn't know. Sorry." His laugh was a chilling sound, like metal tearing. "We were content. We had purpose. We had work to do, routines to follow, lives to live, and you took that away from us." Other figures began to emerge from the shadows. The uranium work crew, Sarah Chun, Frank Miller, dozens of others I'd served over the past month. But they were all wrong now, twisted by the memory of their deaths and the realization of their true condition. Some appeared as they had in life, but with terrible wounds visible. Others had become something altogether different, amalgamations of human form and radioactive decay that hurt to look at directly. "We can't go back," Sarah Chun said, her voice carrying the sound of wind through empty buildings. "The illusion is broken. The peace we found in routine and repetition is gone forever. So we'll find a different kind of peace," Frank Miller added, his face cycling between human and something far more predatory. "The peace that comes from making others share our condition." I realized with growing horror that Joyce had been wrong about the choice the dead faced. They weren't choosing between acceptance and anger. They were choosing between moving on to the afterlife and remaining in Jeffrey City as something far worse than confused spirits. They were becoming supernatural predators, creatures that would feed on the living to sustain their existence in the physical world. "Run," Joyce whispered to me. "Run now and don't look back." "What about you?" I asked, my voice trembling. Her smile was sad but resigned. "This is where I belong. This is where I've always belonged. But you still have a choice." The dead were advancing now, moving with the coordinated purpose of pack hunters. Their forms shifted and wavered like heat mirages, and the air around them crackled with residual radiation that made my skin burn and my eyes water. I ran again, but this time with a different kind of desperation. This wasn't just about escaping a supernatural town. It was about survival against creatures that had been human once but were now driven by hunger and revenge. The broken rules hadn't just disrupted their peaceful existence. They had transformed Jeffrey City's dead into something actively malevolent. As I reached the edge of town, I could feel their presence behind me like a physical weight, pressing against my back and urging me to turn around, to join them in their eternal existence between life and death. The temptation was stronger than I'd expected. The promise of never having to worry about money or failure or loneliness again, of finding a community that would accept me exactly as I was. But I kept running, driven by an instinct for survival that ran deeper than any rational thought. Behind me, Jeffrey City blazed with unnatural light, and the sound of the dead calling my name echoed across the Wyoming desert like a chorus of damnation. I had broken the rules that kept the dead peaceful, and in doing so, I had unleashed something that would haunt the highways of Wyoming for generations to come. The only question now was whether I could escape far enough, fast enough, to avoid becoming another victim of the catastrophe I had created. The gas station's neon sign flickered once behind me, then went dark forever. I ran through the Wyoming night until my legs gave out, collapsing beside Highway 287, about 10 miles from Jeffrey City. Behind me, the town glowed with that sickly green phosphorescence, and I could still hear the distant wails of the dead I'd condemned to eternal awareness of their condition. The guilt was crushing. I had destroyed their peaceful existence, their carefully maintained routines that had given them purpose and comfort in death. But as I sat gasping in the cold desert air, watching the stars whirl overhead in patterns that seemed more familiar than they should have been, fragments of memory began to surface. Fragments that made no sense, yet felt more real than anything I'd experienced in weeks. The guilt was crushing. I had destroyed their peaceful existence, their carefully maintained routines that had given them purpose and comfort in death. But as I sat gasping in the cold desert air, watching the stars whirl overhead in patterns that seemed more familiar than they should have been, fragments of memory began to surface. Fragments that made no sense, yet felt more real than anything I'd experienced in weeks. I remember driving this same stretch of highway 3 months ago in the dead of night, bone-tired from yet another failed job interview in Casper. I recalled my eyelids feeling heavy, the hypnotic pull of the white lines vanishing under the glare of my headlights. I remembered the precise instant when sleep overpowered vigilance, when my grip loosened on the steering wheel and my car began its slow drift toward the shoulder. The crash replayed in my mind with vivid, terrible clarity. The sickening lurch as the car left the asphalt, the world spinning in a chaotic blur as metal shrieked and glass shattered around me. The jarring impact when we finally came to rest, upside down in a drainage ditch, the steering wheel pressing against my chest, and something warm and sticky trickling down my face, and then walking away. I remembered extracting myself from the mangled wreckage with an almost unnatural ease, stepping out into the cool night air without a single scratch. I remembered seeing lights in the distance, the inviting, comforting glow of the atomic stop, and thinking how fortunate I was that someone was open so late. I remembered Joyce greeting me at the door as if she'd been expecting me all along, as if my arrival was just another ordinary event in the unending cycle of Jeffrey City's strange, supernatural existence. The realization slammed into me like a physical blow. I had died in that very crash 3 months ago. Everything since then, the job interview, the training, the month spent serving dead customers, had been nothing more than my mind's intricate defense mechanism against confronting the stark reality of my condition. I was dead. I had been dead all along. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone and tried to call my friends back in Cheyenne, the people who should have been worried sick about my disappearance. But the calls wouldn't go through. The numbers I dialed led to automated recordings stating the lines had been disconnected, or worse, to complete strangers who claimed they'd never even heard the names I was asking about. How long had I been gone? Days? Weeks? Had anyone even noticed my absence? Or had my death been as insignificant as my life? A college dropout who'd failed to forge any lasting connections, whose disappearance would simply be attributed to another young person drifting off in search of themselves somewhere else. As dawn crept closer, I found myself walking back toward Jeffrey City, not because I desired to return, but because I seemed incapable of going anywhere else. Every road I attempted led back to the same desolate intersection. Every direction I walked curved back around to bring me back to the town limits. Like the spectral customers I'd served, I was trapped in a pattern I couldn't break, bound to this place by forces I didn't fully comprehend. The gas station looked undeniably different in the cold morning light. The windows had been meticulously repaired, the merchandise neatly restocked, and the Geiger counter was clicking at its usual background level. It was as if the supernatural upheaval of the previous night had never even occurred. Even the dead customers were back, diligently following their familiar routines with the same scripted politeness they'd always displayed. But something fundamental had shifted. Where before their movements had seemed natural, if repetitive, now I could clearly see the artificiality underlying everything they did. They moved like actors mechanically reciting lines they'd memorized but no longer understood, going through motions that had lost all meaning beyond the simple act of continuation. Joyce was waiting for me behind the counter, her expression a somber mixture of sadness and resignation. "You remember now?" she said softly. It wasn't a question. The crash. Highway 287, 3 months ago. My voice sounded alien to my own ears, hollow and distant. "I died, didn't I?" "Yes," she replied. "But dying doesn't have to mean ending, Marcus, not here. Jeffrey City is a place where people can continue being who they were, doing what they loved, even after their bodies fail them. But they don't love it anymore. After last night, after what I did to them, they're just going through the motions." Joyce nodded sadly. The rules existed for a reason. The peaceful ignorance we maintained wasn't cruel. It was merciful. It allowed the dead to find purpose and routine without the anguish of remembering their loss. You broke that mercy. So what happens now? Now you have a choice. You can fight against your condition, rage against the unfairness of death, and become like those predatory spirits you unleashed last night. Or you can accept your role here and help maintain the balance for others who come after you. Others. As if summoned by her words, the grating screech of brakes and the sickening crunch of crumpling metal echoed from the direction of Highway 287. Joyce and I exchanged a knowing glance, and I felt a cold certainty about what we would find. The crash site was maybe half a mile from the gas station, at the same treacherous curve where I'd lost control 3 months earlier. A blue Honda Civic had careened off the road and rolled several times before coming to rest against a large boulder, its roof crushed and windows shattered. Steam billowed from the ruptured radiator, and the pungent smell of gasoline hung heavy in the desert air. But there was no body in the car. "Hello?" A voice called out hesitantly from the direction of the gas station. "Is anyone there? I think I need help." We found her standing in the parking lot, looking bewildered and disheveled but miraculously unharmed. She was probably in her late 20s, with dark hair and the kind of professional attire that suggested she'd been driving somewhere important when the accident occurred. Her name, according to the ID we found later, was Sarah Williams, and she had died 20 minutes ago in a single-vehicle accident on Highway 287. "Thank God you're open," she said, approaching Joyce with obvious relief. "My car went off the road back there. I think I need to call for a tow truck, maybe an ambulance. I'm not even sure how I walked away from that crash." Joyce's expression was gentle but knowing. "You're very lucky. Not everyone survives accidents like that. Why don't you come inside?" Joyce asked, her voice laced with a practiced kindness. "We can get you some coffee, help you figure out what to do next." As Sarah Williams followed Joyce into the gas station, talking a mile a minute about insurance claims and rental cars, and how she was supposed to be at a job interview in Casper the next morning, I felt the weight of understanding settle over me like a burial shroud. This was how it worked. This was how Jeffrey City maintained its population of the dead. One crash at a time, one lost soul at a time. Each new arrival convinced they had somehow survived the unsurvivable. "Marcus Thompson," Joyce called to me from the doorway. "Would you mind showing Sarah around? Explaining how things work here?" I understood what she was asking. Sarah Williams would need time to adjust, time to accept her new circumstances gradually rather than being forced to confront the truth all at once. And I would be the one to guide her through that process, just as Joyce had guided me. "Of course," I replied, and felt something shift inside me as I said it. An acceptance that this was my purpose now, my role in the supernatural ecosystem of Jeffrey City. Over the next few hours, I showed Sarah Williams around the gas station, explaining the job requirements and procedures with the same careful attention to detail that Joyce had shown me. I introduced her to the apartment upstairs, helped her settle in, and began teaching her the 8 rules that would govern her existence. "These seem pretty specific," Sarah said, reading through the list with the same confusion I'd felt weeks earlier. "What's with the Geiger counter?" "Left over from the uranium days," I replied, using Joyce's exact words. "Some folks around here are sentimental about the old equipment. Just keep it running. Makes them feel more comfortable." "And the company script?" "Some of the old-timers still have bills from when the mine was operating, technically legal tender, and it keeps them happy to use it." As I spoke, I could feel myself falling into the same pattern Joyce had followed with me. Patient explanation, gentle guidance, careful omission of the supernatural truth that Sarah would need to discover for herself over time. It was a kindness, I realized, a way of easing the transition from life to death without the trauma of immediate recognition. That evening, as Sarah Williams began her first shift, I watched her serve the same customers I'd been serving for weeks. Frank Miller with his Tuesday routine, the uranium work crew with their Friday night coffee run, Sarah Chun with her Thursday evening shopping. They treated the new employee with the same polite detachment they'd always shown, their supernatural nature hidden behind facades of small-town courtesy. But I could see the truth now. I could see the radiation burns hidden beneath Frank Miller's work clothes, the skeletal gauntness behind Sarah Chen's friendly smile, the hollow desperation in the uranium workers' eyes as they discussed mine conditions that would never improve. They were all trapped here, just as I was trapped, following routines that gave structure to an existence that had lost all other meaning. "You're learning to see them as they really are," Joyce observed, joining me in the back office as Sarah handled her first few customers. "It's horrible," I said. "They're all suffering, but they don't even know it. Knowledge isn't always kindness, Marcus Thompson. Sometimes ignorance really is bliss." The question is, what are you going to do with what you know? I thought about the predatory spirits I'd unleashed by breaking the rules, the creatures that were probably still wandering the highways of Wyoming, hunting for living victims to sustain their anger and revenge. I thought about Sarah Williams, who was cheerfully serving coffee to dead uranium workers while believing she was simply earning money to replace her wrecked car. "I'm going to help," I said finally. "I'm going to make sure the rules are followed, that new arrivals are treated gently, that the balance is maintained. Someone has to." Joyce smiled, and for the first time since I'd known her, the expression seemed genuinely happy rather than just professionally polite. That's all any of us can do. Take care of each other, maintain the routines that give us purpose, and help newcomers find their place in this strange existence we've been given. 3 months later, I had fully accepted my role as Jeffrey City's night manager and informal guardian of the dead. Sarah Williams had adapted to her new existence with the same gradual acceptance I'd experienced, though she still believed she was simply working to save money for a new car. Other crash victims had arrived, usually one every few weeks, drawn by the same mysterious forces that had claimed me, and I'd guided each of them through the same careful process of integration. The predatory spirits I'd unleashed were still out there somewhere, but they seemed to avoid Jeffrey City itself, perhaps recognizing that this place had its own protective purpose. The town had returned to its peaceful routine, the dead content with their endless repetition of familiar tasks and conversations. Sometimes late at night, when the gas station was quiet and the highway empty, I would remember my old life. The college classes I'd abandoned, the friends I'd lost touch with, the family who had probably given up hope of ever seeing me again. But those memories felt distant now, like scenes from a movie I'd watched long ago. This was my reality. Serving coffee to dead uranium workers, pumping gas for phantom trucks, and helping other lost souls find their place in the supernatural ecosystem of Jeffrey City. And strangest of all, I was content with it. Not happy exactly, but satisfied in a way I'd never been in life. I had purpose, community, and the knowledge that my existence served a greater good. Maintaining the balance between life and death, providing sanctuary for those who weren't ready to move on to whatever came after. The next crash victim, a young man named David who'd succumbed to exhaustion and drifted off at the wheel during a late-night drive, was delivered to my care, and I found myself ready. I assisted him to his feet, gently steering him toward the comforting glow of the Atomic Stop's gas pumps, and initiated the same tender process of integration, the one Joyce had so kindly begun with me and that I had, in turn, extended to Sarah. "Thank God you're open," David breathed, echoing Sarah's words, mirroring my own plea from 3 months prior. "I think I need help." "Of course," I replied, a quiet satisfaction blooming within me, the tangible fulfillment of my newfound purpose. "Welcome to Jeffrey City. Let me show you how things work around here." The cycle, ancient and unyielding, continued its relentless turning, as it always had, as it always would. And I was no longer merely a victim trapped within its orbit. I had become its guardian, its protector, its newest keeper. The Atomic Stop would stand its ground, its doors perpetually open to all travelers who found themselves adrift on the lonely highways of Wyoming, regardless of whether they walked among the living or lingered in the realm of the dead. After all, everyone, even those with nowhere else to turn, deserves a place to belong.